Hello. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to another episode of Barry Hawkins Live. And tonight we're on our second entry in effective development process metrics. Of course, focusing right now in this series on development process at the team level, but metrics nonetheless. The companion that we'll be picking up on tonight is the close friend of throughput or velocity in Scrum. And that close friend in my practice is projected to completed ratio. So let's dive right in, because this is a topic that seems straightforward, but then it can get away from you if you're not careful. So here we go. Let's begin with defining what is projected to completed ratio, because projected to completed ratio is a metric that I added after years of practicing and adapting and evolving Scrum. And I added it because what I found was you could have teams whose velocity looked quite stable, which generally is a goal. But then if you actually sat in on their planning and or looked at their retrospective notes, that sort of thing, it was stable in terms of the volume that happened, but in terms of how tumultuous their sprint planning, backlog grooming, and even work day over day in a given development cycle, those were quite unhealthy, very bumpy. And so I added projected to completed ratio as a complement to throughput. And projected to completed ratio, quite simply, is the ratio of the amount of effort that a team pulls in to a development cycle or sprint during sprint planning compared to the volume of work in the same unit of measure, hopefully typically story points, that they actually fully complete in a cycle. So you can imagine how if you pull in a certain volume of work, let's say 60 points, and if at the end of that cycle you complete 60 points, then the ratio is 1. You projected 60, you completed 60. What throughput doesn't show you is how much teams thought they could do versus how much they actually ended up completing. And so that's what projected to completed ratio seeks to provide. Now, why have that provided? The intent of projected to completed ratio is to give the team an idea of how much confidence they should currently place in their planning activity. And depending on how high or low that ratio is, it tells them certain things. So let's dive into projected to completed ratio. What does the effective use of it look like? First, let's talk about interpreting projected to completed ratio, because it's deceptively simple. Because when you can do the math and arrive at the value dividing projected by completed, and you can come up with a number easily enough. But what does that number mean? Well, let's provide two examples, one high and one low. So let's say a team has a projected to completed ratio of 1.5. So that would mean, just like throughput, projected completed ratio uses a rolling 6-cycle average. So for the last, averaging what that ratio number was for the last 6 cycles, what do you have? And so if it's 1.5, that would mean on average, over the last 6 development cycles, this team completes 2/3 of what they pull in. So if they pull in and project 15 story points, on average, they'll only complete 10 of those 15. So that would be 1.5. So high indicates that you're projecting more than you complete. Now on the other side, let's say that a team had a projected completed ratio of 0.5. So 1.5 is 0.5 above 1. 0.5 is 0.5 below 1. A projected completed ratio of 0.5 would imply that over the last 6 development cycles, on average, this team completes twice as much as what they pull into their cycle planning, what they project. So they regularly plan half of what they end up doing. Now, why is that useful? Well, if you plan more than you end up completing, then you've spent a lot of time looking at, discussing, tasking out, figuring out who's going to run with what during cycle planning. And 2/3 of the work you spent that time discussing and tasking out doesn't get completed. And now those tasks and those assignments have to hang out for at least 2 weeks and then be picked back up. And often the same people who would have run with those tasks in the current sprint won't necessarily be able to be those people who would take those up in the subsequent cycle. Similarly, particularly if a team is doing a lot of net new work, how you would have approached implementation on a given outcome in one cycle might be notably different 1 or 2 cycles later when you're actually able to execute that work. Now, that's with a high number, like the 1.5 example I shared. Now, with a low number, that means that a team is typically pulling in way less than they end up completing. This, I've seen, there are a number of reasons this can happen. Some of them we'll touch on later, but the effect there is if you're only pulling in half of the work you end up doing during cycle planning, that means half of the work, a lot of the work that's actually being completed is not going through all of the discussion, iteration, clarifying questions that happen in backlog grooming and during cycle planning, but rather it's, we still have more capacity. Okay, let's pull it in and task it out. Not necessarily with the amount of discussion, clarification, confirmation that happens in the normal process. And so as a result, you can end up with a lot of completed work, sure, but how did it do once it was released? Did it actually end up being what we thought? Or because it was pulled in and the approach was determined during the cycle, did some of that end up getting rushed and it was a bit of a miss? That's one of the risks if a team is consistently completing more than they actually pull in during planning. Now, that may sound like, okay, so you want to be at 1.0 and stay at 1.0. That is not the case. I want to make it clear that hitting exactly 1.0 is not the goal. But you want to oscillate, at some healthy level around 1. But, being artificially precisely always hitting 1, I usually find that if a team is hitting 1 and staying exactly at 1, they're usually gaming the system and working toward the metric rather than just doing the work and letting the metric reflect, the outcome of the cycle. So hitting 1.0 is not the goal, but you generally want to be oscillating within some acceptable tolerance around 1. If a team's, planning activity and backlog grooming activity are working as intended, serving the purpose that they're meant to serve. So that is projected to completed. So it's quite simple, but applying it, interpreting it appropriately, and using it as intended can be a little more tricky. Typically takes a little bit of time. But 2, you want to be looking at, well, what are the reasons? If a team consistently doesn't complete as much as they pull in, why is that? Or on the other side, if a team regularly completes more than they actually pulled into planning, why is that? And I mean, there can be a number of reasons. I will say that an organization and the management of an organization typically has the most influence on this for me. Sometimes if teams regularly pull in more, then you'll hear a lot of pressure and a lot of language around stretch goals, and teams should be doing more. And as I mentioned in the episode on throughput, there's a misunderstanding and a misperception of velocity that for a given team, it's just supposed to be perpetually scaling up toward infinity, which is not the case. The throughput for a given team is supposed to arrive at a degree of equilibrium with variations that are accounted for by, changes in requirements of priority, changes in who's available to do work in a given cycle. But it's not meant to be just going up, 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 and up. And but if there's that kind of pressure in the organization, or even within the team itself, if we should be able to do more, we should be able to do more, then you'll notice they tend to have a higher projected to completed ratio. Now, on the other side, when teams are regularly completing way more than they actually planned, I typically find that is when leadership or management are punishing teams for having carryover. That is, pulling in work into a cycle that they don't actually complete. And if the punishment or shaming of that is high enough, then what teams will start to do as a regular basis is if this is their capacity, then they're going to plan down here because they're tired of being on the email blast or watching their team square go from green to red, and then everybody's asking what's wrong with you guys, right? So you want to be careful in looking at what is the cause, what is the reason why the metrics look that way. And that segues us into a cautionary note on metrics in general. And I write about this on my website. I talk about this in the training that I provide. But metrics are intended to be an early indicator that are a prompt for conversation. It should be something that informs and begins a discussion, not something that's treated as an outcome that's now to be acted upon. And that's what I see very often with leadership and management, is they treat metrics not as an early indicator and starting point for discussion, but rather this is the number to make a judgment on. So don't do that, because when you do that, that's when you start to incent the negative behaviors as teams try to cope with the suboptimal culture and patterns that you're enforcing, whether you know it or not. Now, to take a look at a visual example, this is how I typically track agile development process metrics. I have a super simple tracking sheet. I'll share a Google Sheets example of that in the video description below. But you can see here as a team, it's their first 6 cycles 1 through 6. They're along the horizontal axis, and then on the vertical axis, you have their projected to completed ratio. So their first cycle, 1.64. So they pulled in a good bit more than they could complete. The second cycle was similar. Now you can see here in the third and fourth cycles, just how far over they were. It clearly became a point of conversation. And the rolling 6 cycle average, which first there's just one data point and then a second one, but by the time you get to the third one, you can see how they're course correcting, but it's only gradually pulling that rolling average down. So it's similar to throughput in that you want to have that rolling 6 cycles, because one individual cycle's improvement or deterioration would not be a full cause for highly corrective action. You want to look at how it's trending, and you can see here the next cycle was not as high as the first 2 had been in terms of overcommitment, but still a bit up, but still trending, generally pulling the trend down. And then their 5th and 6th cycles, now getting into a healthy tolerance, and you can see that it's pulling their average, their projected to completed ratio 6 cycle average, down toward a healthier period where they can be oscillating around that healthy value of 1. So yeah, that's what it tends to look like. All right. On the interestingly, on the topic of metrics, a colleague of mine, Lauren Hochstein, he's at Netflix. Netflix was a client of mine years ago, and then I did join them full time for a while to do some things. And while I joined, Lauren had joined around the same time there in 2015, and got to know him. He's a wonderful person. He shared a tweet earlier today about metrics that I really liked. He says here, my general perspective on metrics is just because the numbers look good doesn't mean things are actually good. On the other hand, if the numbers look bad, things are probably bad, but you probably didn't need the numbers to tell you that. And in response to that tweet, I had actually shared in reply that there you go. That further, the numbers telling you things look bad is a prompt for conversation instead of a final judgment. To which Lauren replied, where was it? Oh, I didn't capture his. That's the purpose of metrics, and it was interesting just in an engineering context, not heavily process related, just to have a colleague bring that very topic up today. So yes, metrics, indicators to prompt conversation and investigation, not final endpoints upon which to decide punishment, reward, what have you. All right, we're at that point of looking at questions. So what submissions have come in today? What are some common causes for low or high projected to completed? Well, mostly the things that I covered earlier about if teams are pushed to commit to more than they know they can do, that tends to push it high. If a team is overconfident or just feels like, well, we should be able to do more, then that can take a number high. I'll also say another possibility there is if teams are pulling pulling outcomes into their development cycles because they feel like, oh, we should totally be able to do this. But then when they begin to work on the outcomes, they discover that there were lots of details that had not been clarified beforehand. That is, if in backlog maintenance and backlog grooming, they're not really fleshing things out at the appropriate time, then they're discovering that in the cycle. So as a result, their completed work ends up being much lower than they thought they were going to be able to. That's another key cause there. And then for the low projected to completed number, again, if teams are going to be punished for not making what they projected, it's one of the reasons. So I stopped. I called this metric years ago committed to completed. It alliterated better, and was keying off of the Scrum idea of the sprint commitment. But what I have found is that when you use the term commitment, it can turn development cycles for a team into little tiny waterfalls, because even during an execution cycle, there's still unknowns. And so if you turn it in terms of a commitment, well, you're committed to, like, regardless of what you discover or find or what you uncover, this is the commitment, you should make this, as opposed to, well, this is our projection. Now, you want to be able to hit a projection, but there's just a semantic. I have found that in terms of trying to create a psychologically safe space for development teams to understand their capacity, and with one of the key outcomes of effective development process, to be able to cultivate an understanding, help a team cultivate an understanding of their capacity, I've just found projected to be better language than committed. But if teams are, being pressured, you have to make the sprint commitment. If you committed to 50 points, by God, there better be 50 points done at the end. Then that's when I typically see low committed to completed, because it's like, well, let's kind of pad this or sandbag this, because we don't want to be like those guys that got called out last sprint, because they had 5 or 10 points carryover. So those are some of the common causes. So you can see that it's usually a team still being early in their journey of maturation, or external forces like management, leadership, stakeholders putting what are usually dysfunctional pressures on teams. Next, what do you do when a team has a high or low projected to completed ratio but ignores it? Well, if I have teams who have metrics that definitely align with what I'm seeing in their planning effectiveness, I'll ask clarifying questions during cycle planning. If I see them overcommitting or undercommitting, then I just ask it as I don't try to say, well, the ratio is this, you should be able to do this, but I just clarify, like, hey, so this looks like we're still going to do, we look like we're committing to a number of points that will get us about where we were the last time, and I mean, if we look on average the last 6 times, we typically end up being able to do a lot more, but then we're figuring it out kind of YOLO, coming in hot during the cycle. So is there really more we could plan? Or if I see us like, well, we're already over, we're already 20 points over our velocity, like we tend to do we really think we're going to be able to do this? Should we really spend time planning and tasking this out? So just ask it in terms of a clarifying question, an open-ended clarifying question, to again spark dialogue, because at the end of the day, the team does have to decide that it matters to them, because you can browbeat or pressure them all you want, but you can't force a person or a team to internalize a given value. You just have to reinforce that it's important, that it's part of what their effectiveness is being measured by, and part of what they're held accountable to, both as individuals and as a team. So that's what I typically do in that case. Lastly, what metrics aside from development process metrics do you recommend teams use? Well, this series is focused on development process for sure, but in terms of other metrics, I find uptime metrics, escape defect rates. Metrics, again, this is outside of development process, which is the question. Metrics that measure the health and effectiveness of the service or applications that you develop and own I tend to find those to be effective metrics for a team to use, because again, we're focused on the team level right now. If you have metrics or information around code coverage, cyclomatic complexity, if you have other metrics like that are important to your team and to the applications or services or code bases that you work on, those tend to be good metrics. KPIs like product growth, subscription growth, conversion, those are trickier, because again, at the team level, you want to have metrics that you have the agency to affect, and higher level metrics that involve the work of way more than just your team. To couple yourself too much or to put too much weight or correlation between a very large or overarching metric that's well outside your agency to affect fully, or even significantly in some cases, that tends to not be a good thing to anchor yourself to, because then you're looking at a metric that's going to fluctuate and change, that has less and less correlation with what you're actually doing. So generally, metrics outside of development process metrics, things that closely correlate to what you work on and that you have a high degree of agency to influence or affect. So there you go. That is projected to completed ratio, which is the last of the 2 development process metrics at the team level. So we'll be picking up with the next chapter, next aspect of effective development team process in our next episode. Until then, if you're enjoying these, please do like and subscribe and click that notification bell. It helps the channel grow, helps get the content out to more people who might find value as well in this content. And until then, I wish you the most healthy teams and effective development process you can possibly have. Thank you, and we'll see you next episode. Take care.